This video will be about David Suzuki's short essay, It Always Costs. And I like teaching this essay because it tends to go against certain dominant attitudes that are arguably held by a lot of people. So in other words, it's going against the status quo. It's going against popular knowledge on particular topics, in this case, technology, to say, look, most people think this, I'm offering a contrary view. And so what often happens in reading this essay, in teaching this essay, is there's certain knee-jerk reactions to the essay for a variety of reasons, which I hope will I can outline here. Now, the textbook says that the thesis of his piece is in the title, It Always Costs. That technology always has a cost. Excuse me, I'd actually somewhat disagree with that statement in the textbook, that it's not the full thesis, it's half of the thesis. Remember that a thesis statement is an argument with evidence. So in this case, he is offering half of a thesis statement. He's offering an argument, technology always costs, but he doesn't yet have any evidence in that. So we need to look at the essay and the examples that he gives in the essay to understand the evidence. So we'll look at that as we go. Now, I said that this essay works against kind of popular ideas of what many or most people think. So just for example, David Suzuki, arguably his reputation precedes him. That some people may have preconceived ideas of who David Suzuki is and what he represents. Okay, so David Suzuki is trained as a geneticist. He's a scientist. He worked at the University of British Columbia for many, many years. But he's also a broadcaster on CBC. He's run The Nature of Things for decades. And he has commitments to environmental policies. So he's a scientist, he's a popular figure, he's a commentator on science, and he's an environmentalist. So depending on where you live in the world and what you think, you might agree or disagree with him. So for example, Suzuki is often the subject of bad arguments attacking him, okay? Not based on what he says, but on who he is, okay? And that's an important difference to understand, that Suzuki is a person, okay? And we can attack the person, or we can attack the person's ideas, okay? And sometimes these two things get confused. So for example, I'll give you a simple example. People say, oh, David Suzuki, he's an environmentalist, but look at him, he's such a hypocrite. He travels to conferences, he flies in airplanes, he owns a big house in Vancouver with lots of lights, and he burns energy. Okay? So we don't have to take him seriously as an environmentalist because he doesn't do what he says, right? It's like, okay, well, what do you expect him to do? Live in a cave, under a rock and not use any resources? Like, people can live in the world, they can drive a car, and they can, turn on a light bulb and use electricity and still be an environmentalist. They may not be perfect. They are using some fossil fuels, perhaps, but, they can still make arguments about the general human use of resources on a wide global scale, okay? That's not to, apologize for him, but it is to defend against what we call ad hominem attacks, the attacks to the man, as the Latin translation is. That we attack the man, look at him, he's a hypocrite, rather than his ideas. Environmentalism could save the planet. That's a good idea. Is he a bad man? Maybe. I don't know. But is his idea good? Perhaps. Okay? So we should have the critical capacity to separate the person from the ideas. Sometimes they coincide nicely, other times they do not, and we have to kind of puzzle that through for ourselves. Okay? So the central premise of this essay is that technology always costs, and so it presents a perhaps uncommon view on technology to say, look, there's downsides to technology. Because I would argue that generally speaking, we think that technology is usually two things. It's either a good thing, or if it's not a good thing, it's at least value neutral. That is, if we take, a phone or a pen or a gun, we can say, well, it's just a technology. It just sits there on the table. It's an object. It's not in and of itself good or bad. It's neutral. It's how we use it. Okay? And so you can see where this is going, right? Is that usually we use technology for good. Having cell phones is a great convenience. Having medical technologies is awesome. It can save lives and stuff. These things are all good. But then we can, of course, see the downsides of technology from the examples that he uses, that we have pesticides like DDT. Yeah, they reduce pests on food so we can grow crops, but they also create pollution in an environment. Okay? And this is kind of where Suzuki's argument is going, is that we often emphasize the positives of technologies and not really the negatives. We sort of acknowledge that they're there, but we say, in a cost-benefit analysis, the positives outweigh the negatives. And sometimes when we get into these spaces where we're forced to kind of rethink a technology, we say, well, it's all in how you use it. The technology itself isn't bad. It's how we use it. So the problem is us and not the technology. And Suzuki's actually kind of asking us to think a little bit differently about that, to say, look, technologies can actually be bad. Not necessarily just in how we use them, although that's certainly part of it, but technology itself might have something about it that we should think a little more critically, rather than in positive or neutral terms, but also in negative terms, just to balance it out and have a thorough understanding. Okay? So that's this thing. Generally we'll say, well, I'll get the newer iPhone, I'll get the more efficient car, I'll get the this, I'll get the that, because newer is better. So I think that's kind of a general thing. But even in something like, that looks good on the surface, like a car, okay, that if I say I'm going to buy an electric car, people say, wow, what a progressive idea. We could look at this and say, well, you know what? The technology of the car itself is problematic, whether it's a diesel guzzling or gas guzzling car versus an electric car. Cars as a technology are a problem. The ability to move quickly from place to place, okay, perpetuates an economy that is destructive to the environment. So what we see is that refinements in technology, a gas car versus an electric car, doesn't actually get at the fundamental question of the car. It gets at the fundamental question of the power source of the car, electric versus fossil fuel, okay? So we could make an argument that, yeah, electric cars are better than fossil fuel cars for the environment, but we could say cars themselves are bad for the environment, that no cars would be better for the environment than cars, because we'd have to rethink social structures, the layout of cities, how we get around, all these kinds of things, which would change how we would approach our lives in general, how we would have, ideas of the economy. And so this is where we get these kinds of knee-jerk responses to some of the arguments that Suzuki makes, and other environmentalists, for example. People will say, well, we should get rid of cars. And people will automatically have these knee-jerk reactions to a statement like that, to say, well, what are you going to do? Go live in a cave? And notice I've used that example before because it often comes up when we say, we should use less fossil fuels. What are you going to do? Live in a cave? No, that's not what we're saying. We're just, environmentalists might say, maybe we should just use less of it. Okay? Or maybe we should transition away from it into something else. What are you going to do? Live in a cave? No. We're going to use solar power or wind power or geothermal power or something other than fossil fuels. We don't have to go all the way down that other avenue and start living in caves again. We just have to rethink the technology, that maybe the technology of power, of energy in the form of fossil fuels could be substituted for something else. It's possible. Okay, and we don't have to fall into these knee-jerk reactions. So like the ad hominem attacks where we attack the man or the person, David Suzuki, we also want to be careful when we look at the ideas, that when someone says, let's use alternative energy, they're not saying let's live in a cave. They're saying let's use alternative energies. And so we don't want to misconstrue counter-arguments. Okay? So you should think about, what is the argument that he's making about technology. And so in this essay, he's using technology in a very broad definition, that most of us think of technology in terms of computers and electronics, cell phones, laptops, high-tech stuff. Technology often gets conflated with high technology, okay? The cutting edge, computerized stuff. And it doesn't have to be that. Something like crop rotation, from the medieval period is a technology. Okay, that technologies can be ideas and ways of doing things. So the horse and buggy is a technology. Animal husbandry, dog breeding, those kinds of things are technologies. Okay, so he's construing it very broadly here. So we often don't think of technologies in the older sense of the term. So, for example, some people who talk about, contemporary climate problems and environmental problems often go back to agriculture as one of the foundational technologies that started creating problems for humans, because it led to settlements and to towns, which led into industrialization and other technological advances, okay, saying maybe we need to rethink agriculture. Now that's where we're actually bordering on going back and, living in caves, well, more accurately, being hunter-gatherers, right? That those things become difficult to try and unseat because they are very deep-seated in our experience in human civilization. So to go to a pre-agricultural time, yeah, we're talking about very regressive ideas in terms of rolling back the technology. I'm not sure I would even want to, agree with that one, but it's an intellectual exercise. How could we rethink agriculture to be less destructive? Because so often we just think of it as a given. Well, we need to grow crops. Well, what if we step back and say, wait, what if we didn't? What if we did something else? So Suzuki gives lots of different examples in his piece that support this idea, ranging, across a whole field of things from, drilling to DDT to birth, to morning sickness pills, thalidomide, and so forth. To say, look, these things initially were great, but we have to look at the consequences. So the overall, structure of this argument is cause and effect, that we have these technologies and they do good things, but what are the effects of those technologies? Okay. And so in a lot of discussions around thesis statements in writing essays, if you're responding to this and if you're writing an essay, often teachers like myself will say, your thesis should recommend something, to believe in, and often as a guide to belief and action, okay, that we should do something. One of the interesting things about Suzuki's piece is that his recommendation for action is to not act, right? The line that students often quote is the final line that he says, we don't have to do things just because we can. He's saying, let's not follow the next technology. Let's think it through. And the other interesting thing about this piece that can be quite challenging for students to understand is that he's asking us to think about things that not only that we don't know, but also that we can't know. That one of the things he says is that we can't know the consequences of our technology. We can only implement the technology and wait and see what happens. We can try and predict, and sometimes we're accurate, but often we're not accurate. So we actually can't make an informed decision. And so students are often quick to point out, he says, let's get a panel of experts. But if you pay close attention to this essay, he says, that's not enough. That doesn't work. It doesn't solve the problem. We can never have enough experts because we can't know the future. And that's not to say that we have to give up, but that leads him to what he calls, the terrible conclusion. How do we predict what we can't know? Well, we can't. And it's very frustrating if you're a thinker to say, well, I want to know, but I can't know, but I want to know, but I can't know. It's a paradox, okay? And that's what leads him to his conclusion. We don't have to do everything just because we can. We may see the benefits, but we need to be very careful about the costs. And that so often is an unpalatable argument to people because they see the benefits very clearly. That's why they invented the technologies. But sometimes the consequences are not clear, and we need to be careful in our implementation of these technologies.